in our third installment of Webinar Wednesday. The topic for today's presentation is going to be academic dossier preparation and what to expect for tenure. And we're glad to have Mark Aldenderfer with us today from UC Merced. Following Mark's presentation this afternoon, we'll have a bit of time for questions and answers. And at any time throughout the presentation, you can submit your questions using the Q&A tab or through the comment section. And following Mark's presentation, we'll have Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Mark.
Great, thanks, Dion, very much, and thanks everybody who's in attendance today. You can't answer me, Jessica, but I saw you online, so hi, I hope you're doing well. I do know one person there in any case. So as Dion said, this presentation is about preparing your dossier for tenure. Let me tell you why I have some qualification doing this. Let's see if we can make this go to the next one. I'm a dean right now. I've been at 5 Research 1 universities. They call them doctoral, very high research, activity. So I've been around in terms of seeing people get tenure, not get tenure. As a dean, I see dozens, if not more, tenure cases over the last 4 or 5 years or so. So I know more or less what works and what doesn't work. I know for many disciplines, and I know particularly about anthropology. So I do have enough experience to at least give you some basics on how to think about this approach, what you're going to need to do in order to prepare your dossier for tenure. And so I'd just like to go through those ideas with you today to give you a sense of what it's going to be to get through this process in a positive way. It's obvious if you take a look at this image on the screen right now, we all know this, but it's worth repeating. There are many more people than jobs right now. And what that means is your competition is rather substantial. I remember back when I first was at UC Santa Barbara many years ago, many of the faculty there at that time had been hired during the late 1960s and early 1970s during the huge boom of academic employment in the United States. And when I asked them questions about, well, how many pubs did you have when you got your job offer, they said, pubs. I wasn't even done with my dissertation. So the situation that you face is really substantially different than it was, back then. And even within the last 10 years, I've seen it ramp up rather substantially. So that when I take a look at job applicants here at this university, we find that the majority of them have at least 1 or 2 publications already in on their CVs and are ready to try to move forward. So the demand is high for the kinds of things you're going to need to produce. It might not sound fair, and it probably isn't, but the reality is it is the reality. Working hard now is critical. It's also important that wherever you happen to be in this process, if you're a grad student, if you're a junior professor, any of the above, you need to be thinking about what this is going to look like now. In other words, it's not too early to start planning for your tenure dossier. The sooner you can start thinking about this, the more important, the more effective it will be for you to develop a tenure case that really is going to work for you. So please take it seriously. I know you are, but it's important to make it clear that taking it seriously means some significant planning. I will say honestly, back when I was a grad student and first coming out, we never got any kind of real support about how this process actually worked. No one spent the time to tell us about dossiers or CVs and all that stuff. They just assumed, well, you got your Ph.D., hit the road, you'll find a job, don't worry, we'll write you letters when we feel like it. And, it's not like that anymore. You need to be prepared now. Finally, the last bullet point that suggests that this primarily is for people who are on the tenure track or contemplating a tenure track. It might very briefly look at people with an applied focus, but that's really not the emphasis today. That is, I'm sure there would be other webinars or other sorts of resources that the AAA has to provide you with some insights when you are, in fact, in an applied context or an applied anthropologist. So with that in mind, let's move on. There's 2 fundamentals that you really need to have some very great control over right now. The first one is, what do you want? What do you think you want? And there's a web link underneath there that I recommend you go to when we're done with this presentation or when you have some time to think about the things that we've talked about today. The website is called The Professor is In. It's a woman who has been a faculty member, a tenured faculty member at least one university. She's got a good academic record. She now has a consulting business. I have no connection with the business whatsoever, so no kickbacks coming on here. But what you find is when you go to her website, she has a lot of really fundamentally sound advice about how to think about all different kinds of aspects of your academic career. So I'd recommend that you go to this at some point when you're thinking about these things. You know, she's blunt, she's outspoken, and she really keeps it real in the sense of these are the things you need to worry about in terms of shaping and forming your career, both as you're beginning to think about applying for jobs as well as going into the tenure process itself. The particular link I've showed you about is her, and the reason why I bring that link up is because she makes it clear in that link, and then there's some links inside that particular document that I'm having you look at that show stories about other people who thought they wanted a job in a tenure track university position. That is, they thought they wanted to be a professor in a research university. They thought they wanted to be a dedicated anthropologist of some kind out there doing, high quality research in their field. And the reality is that many of us think that's what we want to do, but you need to really step back from this and search your own soul out here. And I don't mean this lightly. I mean that if you don't really believe it, and you really are not willing to put up the sacrifices to make that happen, you might think about doing something different with the career. This is not to discourage anyone from thinking about a career in anthropology. It's just that make sure you're really ready to go. And I don't mean this as you have a calling in anthropology. Let's just not go there. You really have to be dedicated to the craft of being an anthropologist and really understand what it's going to take to do research and teaching and service. So read the stories of some of the people who thought they wanted to do these things, but then as they found, they backed away from them because they really weren't prepared to either do the things that they needed to do, weren't prepared for the sacrifices that were going to be entailed, or really weren't ready for the kind of, in some jobs, the kind of grinding aspect of the positions themselves. So read them, please. The second point is that it's very simple, and I think all of you know this already, but it's worth repeating. You really need a network. I mean, what I mean by that is you need a network of peers, people who are your comrades in grad school, people who are above you or below you in terms of the class in grad school, people who are outside your immediate body of peers that are in your subfield, in your discipline, that you can actually then bounce ideas off of. In other words, these are people you know. These are people who you can trust to give you feedback. They can give you advice. They can give you critical commentary on your ideas. But you need a network, and it's much more important to have a network these days than ever before because it's not just who you know. It's also knowing people, knowing the quality people in your field, and developing solid and secure relationships with those people. Again, these were things that really, they're obvious to all of us today. But back when I was a grad student so many years ago, these were things that were simply taken for granted. Now I think one of the most important things you can do, no matter what stage of your career you find yourself, is that you really need to be developing this network as often as you can and really keeping it alive and healthy and just making sure that people know who you are and know the kind of work that you're doing. Those are the basics. Okay, you got a job. Congratulations. Now I know some of you in this webinar might not have jobs at this point, but hopefully you will have one. And the question now becomes, what do you do with that job when you're in it? Well, we all know, of course, that you're supposed to be doing teaching and research and service. But let's kind of drill down a little bit and give you a better sense of, all right, how should you be approaching your position with the eventual eye toward tenure? The first thing you need to remember in this whole process is that you really are an anthropologist and you really are a trained observer. And that's not a joke. You need to use your anthropological skills as best you have learned them to essentially learn what that first bullet point says. It says, learn the culture of your position. In other words, you need to understand what the landscape of your particular job entails. Some places are remarkably open, lots of good people there, lots of folks who seem to be willing to cooperate, but there are other places that are not so like that. And so your job as an anthropologist is to really begin to use some of your ethnographic techniques and really get a sense of how do these people interact? What appear to be the norms of interaction? For junior faculty in my position at this university, Are they expected to speak up? Are they expected to interact with their senior colleagues? What's the nature of that interaction? So just pretend like these are subjects. Now, you're not going to do participant observation in the sense that you're going to ask them direct questions on, as I've outlined, but you really need to be providing yourself with the information gleaned from observation, gleaned from the people that you can trust in this position to really understand how these people interact. You know, larger departments are often factionated. They have groups of individuals, have different ideas and different opinions. As we all know, the subdisciplines in many departments in the United States right now have split off amongst themselves, and they have greater or lesser contact with one another. These are things you need to understand as you walk into the door of this position. So, you know, you'll probably have scoped some of that out as you begin to take on your position, but as you go through time, understanding just who's who in this process and how that culture of the atmosphere of that department works is really important. The second bullet point, and we'll come back to this one in the later conversation today, is that you really need to understand the fact that there are of course, politics in this field. And again, I keep using my own experience here, but it was very painful at the beginning. You know, I thought at some point said, I'll go into academia because, you know, there's no politics in the academy. I can just go study what I want. Well, yeah, sure, right. We know that's not the case. Don't be so naive. My point about the web link that I've showed you there is that don't necessarily think of you picking battles. That is, you don't want to think about any interactions with your colleagues as necessarily battles, but what this web link is really trying to give you a sense of is how do you begin to navigate some of the political shoals that you will find inevitably in any program that you happen to find yourself in. There will be discussions about teaching, students, research, anything and everything can come up as a political topic. And the question then that you have to answer for yourself based on your ethnographic research in this program is just how you learn how to handle them. It's really important that you understand your own personality in this as well. That is, you need to understand the kind of person you are and the way in which you deal with potential conflict, because that ultimately sets the stage for the way in which people will judge you when tenure time comes. And believe me, personality, collegiality, and fit make a big difference regardless of what the actual paper says about the way in which the tenure process works. You must do your absolute fundamental best to find out exactly what the expectations for tenure are. This is beyond critical in the sense that many departments have written documents that you need to get your hands on, and they will show you need to do the following sorts of publications and the following kinds of journals. Other places, as you'll see from some of the examples I give in a few moments, they're far more vague about these things, and there's really open to interpretation about how you achieve this or that or the other within your tenure bid. Regardless of how vague or firm these are, you need to get them, and then you need to consult widely with your peers as well as the senior members of your faculty to get a real sense of, okay, what really has worked here? What has not worked? Who are the people that have gone through tenure here? What were their experiences? And you can find that out by talking to people that have been there for a while. So do your utmost to get this information. You'll notice I put a NB there, nota bene, about joint appointments. These are real traps for junior people these days. That is, often you'll find yourself in a split appointment that you have to serve two distinct masters. That is, one program might be in, let's say, anthropology, and another part of your appointment might be in something, let's say, ethnic studies. You know, the problem is that you're going to have to try to satisfy both of those constituencies. Many of them, sometimes one will have a great deal of definitive statements about what they think they want, the other one won't, or vice versa. These are tough places for junior people to be in, and so I think that the more you can do when you're in a joint appointment like this to understand exactly what it is each one of these constituencies offers is truly critical for your progress. I've seen too many people in joint appointments that get hung up on one of the schools or the other, or one of the departments or the other, and simply fail to make it through the tenure process because one half of the people voting on them simply did not believe they were merited tenure in that particular program. Then you have a problem. Finally, the last bullet point makes it clear that you need to develop what's called a 5-year plan. You can call it a 6-year or 7-year plan, depending on your circumstances and situation. The point is, start planning this now. And so I give you 2 links down there from the professor is in that gives you a sense of what this plan should in fact look like. Now, let's be clear, you're not going to meet every expectation that you put onto that plan. I get it. But simply having a document like that gives you the context within which to start planning how you will begin to approach your career objectives. So do your best to create this plan, and even if you deviate and stray from it, the good news is at least you've got a structure by which you know where you think you should be going over the course of your career. Very briefly, I want to touch upon the kinds of expectations that universities and colleges and schools have about the tenure process. That is, what they expect you to have achieved during the time of your junior professorship at that school. And so very, very briefly, if you take a look at the table I have here, you'll see that there are 3 different kinds of schools: doctoral, master's, and baccalaureate programs. Doctoral programs in the Carnegie classifications have a variety of different levels in them. The point being is that these are research universities, and therefore their research expectations are quite high. Their teaching expectations are often somewhat lower. It just depends on the nature of that university, how much teaching load you actually have. And then service, well, service, as we'll talk about later on, will be very low for most of those, or to some extent moderate, again, depending on where you are. A master's university tends to be kind of the regional universities. So for instance, in California, the University of California is seen as the doctoral granting program. And although there are a few Cal States that actually have doctoral programs, for the most part, you would call them master's regional universities. The research expectation is somewhat lower, and again, these things depend. Teaching much higher. Teaching loads tend to be significantly higher, and your service loads tend to be relatively high as well for a variety of reasons. And finally, at the baccalaureate level, what you'll find is that there's a series of possibilities. You know, these are the small teaching colleges ranging from the relatively small religious institutions to relatively small liberal arts colleges. Sometimes these have a very clear research focus, and therefore their research emphasis is somewhat higher. Teaching tends to be high, though, across most of them. And then service tends to be high to moderate as well. You're doing a lot more interaction with students, a lot more interaction with your colleagues. Even though there might be efforts to protect you from those activities and services, the fact of the matter remains is that the level tends to be higher than you would find at a research university. But keep in mind that this is just a general picture and that there's a great deal of variability out there. So again, going back to the previous image that I showed you, make sure you understand the exact specifications insofar as you can get them from your local institution. Okay, now don't try to read this. I hate it when people try to put these things on slides. That's not the point. Read this at your leisure. What I wanted to do is to give you things I could find relatively easily online that provide you with some sense of what a research-intensive university talks about. I'll show you a master's level regional university, then I'll show you one from a baccalaureate institution. What I tried to do then is to go through these images and give you a sense of, I highlighted certain things that seem to be more or less specific about what these universities actually are attempting to get. The first 2 are going to be very much for anthropology programs. The last one is relatively more generic, as you'll see in a moment. So if you just kind of scan through here, you'll notice that this whole block of text right here is all about scholarship. It's not about service and teaching. We'll get there in a moment. But you'll notice the first paragraph says highly regarded peer-reviewed journals and or a book in a university press. Pretty clear guidance, but again, the question is highly regarded peer-reviewed journals. We'll get to some of those details later. Refereed book chapters, quite good. Second paragraph, preponderance of candidates' publications in appropriate and highly ranked journals. Well, that's good. Notice the ISI impact factor. We'll talk about that as we go down the road as well. The third paragraph has a variety of statements saying that, well, in some disciplines, there is a different kind or level of expectation about the kinds of publications. Yeah, that's stuff that you'll learn about when you're in that program. And again, these generic guidelines need to be fleshed out and become specific in conversations with your mentors and peers at that university. So this gives you a sense then of what a research university's expectations are as for tenure. You'll notice then when you turn to teaching and service, same university, same program, the amount of verbiage, if you will, on both teaching and service is quite substantially smaller. And this tends to be the case. That is, universities will tell you, yeah, we value teaching, but when you're at a research university, it doesn't mean that you can slack off on your teaching per se. It just means that do a good job teaching, but spend most of your time fussing with your publications and your grant proposals and things of that sort, depending on the kind of place you are. So you'll notice then the shift in emphasis in the way in which teaching and scholarship and service are emphasized. Here's now a regional master's level program. You can see then that this is a much briefer set of expectations. This happens to be a department of sociology and anthropology. And I think that many people in our field these days, when they go out to the world and get their first job, they're going to be primarily at either small baccalaureate institutions or they're going to be in regional universities. And so this might be far more appropriate for the bulk of people getting ready to go through, either get a job or go through the tenure process right now. And you notice then that it starts out, instead of research, this statement starts out with teaching. And they emphasize that very clearly because at these level of universities, teaching is the predominant way in which you're judged. And then you'll notice down below in the second major paragraph, it says clearly, achievements equivalent to 4 scholarly peer-reviewed publications, some of which may be in the in-press stage at the time of tenure. Well, that's a very relatively low bar for that university. But given your teaching load, it might be relatively high. Well, it might be relatively difficult to achieve that. And as some universities, as we'll point out later, some universities only count the material that you have done while at that university and not necessarily the material before that. And we'll speak of that to some extent later. We'll also notice then down below there's some expectation about professional meetings as well. So again, you'll see the emphasis is quite different here. And then finally, this is a baccalaureate college, Smith College. This is a generic one because they have nothing online that spoke directly about anthropology. They call themselves a baccalaureate institution with a research emphasis. So their teaching expectations are about the same as a research-intensive university. And you'll notice then that the guidance is relatively unclear in the written documents. Written work is the best guide, scholarly publications and capabilities. You know, other people will judge you. Yeah, we get all that. And so it's all pretty much condensed in there. I happen to know one of my former students is at Smith, and she told me that the expectation in general is for a number of peer-reviewed, of peer-reviewed journal articles and or a book or things that are relatively equivalent. So that's where the knowledge of the local culture becomes important, and you glean that directly from your senior colleagues or from your peers as to getting that information effectively from them. So the point of all these is that to give you a sense of the range of possibilities. So if you happen to find yourself in one of these places right now, if you're in the tenure track, this gives you a sense of where you should be going. Hopefully you know this information already. If not, go out and find it right now. So we need to talk a bit now about what the evidence becomes for quality scholarship. And this is sort of the larger picture then. This is not the specifics. We'll get into some of those at the moment. So obviously what counts depends on the culture. We've just described some of those aspects of that, but also the subdiscipline. So I recall having a conversation with friends and UCLA, which is a research-intensive university. And there were very significant differences between the expectations of the archaeologists versus those in the biological anthropology field versus those in the cultural side. The cultural side almost always required some kind of single-authored book, as we'll see. Biological anthropology and archaeology emphasized peer-reviewed journal articles, and to a lesser extent or greater extent, depending on the field itself or the department itself, they want you to go out and at least show evidence for getting grants. So you need to be clear on those things. I think most of us are these days, but again, it never hurts to verify those expectations clearly. And given the fact that departments are fractionated in some cases, that is fractionated, that is making sure that there's a clear understanding that, yes, I'm in this particular subdiscipline, these are the requirements, is important to communicate that to others in other subdisciplines so that they're aware of the kinds of expectations that are generally appropriate for you in your particular place. Now, the sense is that we often believe that, well, we need to have many more publications. And that is true. More tends to be better, all things being equal. But quality and the place in which those publications is also extremely important. There's one thing you need to be very careful of when you start thinking about this more is better. It's really not a good idea to cut and paste and kind of extract pieces from one paper, you know, kind of put a new introduction on it, sort of put another back end on it and try to get that into a different publication venue if it is significantly or substantially the same as something that's already published. And I know there's a lot of debate about that. There's a lot of people who believe, well, that's fair, because after all, it is your work. And other people would say, yeah, well, it's your work, but it's not necessarily new. It's just been tweaked. That's a judgment call. And I can't offer you more advice other than to say that the more original the work appears to be at this stage, the more likely it is that people will accept it as being evidence of quality scholarship. I've seen as journal editor times when people have published a full book with a reputable university press, and the article looks really great until you find that one of the peer reviewers says, by the way, you should go look at chapter X of this person's book because it's essentially taken verbatim out of the book. Well, when I'm the journal editor, I say, well, that material is already published. I cannot accept your publication at that point. So this is something that you need to be aware of and be cautious on when you're putting together these questions. One thing we often hear about is how independent is your research? In other words, have you divorced yourself in an amicable way from your advisors? That is, if they gave you a dissertation topic and you published on it, you show evidence of having a new research trajectory. You don't have to, depending on the quality and the kind of research you're doing, but I've seen in my job here at this university, some people get critiqued, well, they're not independent enough from that individual, that is their advisor. So be aware of this, and again, this is where the culture comes in. Have you moved on from your dissertation? Obviously, that makes a difference. That is, if you can show that you have a trajectory where you're headed, this is excellent because that means that you're actually, you're charting out where you want to be in 5 years, which is the very important criterion when people are thinking about hiring you, is that they often ask you that question, where will you be? And then finally, what's your research trajectory? Do you appear to be slow? If you are slow, why is that the case? Is it the fact that you're still generating data or you're still digesting data? Can you demonstrate that, yes, you're doing that, but will there be a large number of publications that come out in year 3 or 4 based on this early work? So again, thinking about how you put together this research, and you may be fast, you may be slow, but being able to communicate that to peers and to senior faculty becomes important. Okay, this is kind of the punchline of much of this conversation is that this is where you should be spending your time. That is, regardless of your subfield, you've already scoped that out. You think you know where you're supposed to be in terms of the expectations of that subfield. This is the way in which you want to think about the things that are going to count the most for you. So you'll notice I have an A list and a B list and then a avoid list at all points at this stage of your career. You can go through the A list, and it's pretty clear we've already talked about many of these things. Journal articles, single authored book, if that's what your subdiscipline wants. Peer-reviewed book chapters are great. Be really careful, though, of what are called vanity presses or presses that are kind of on the margins. I know AAA is thinking about putting together a list or a conversation about predatory publishers of one kind or another, or presses that have a less than glowing reputation. You want to be careful of getting your material into venues like that, simply because, the word gets around that these things are lightly peer-reviewed in many ways, and you really don't want to have that being a stigma on that particular publication. Extramural funding, if your subdiscipline requires it, you got to try. It's always better, of course, if you get some, but showing evidence is really important. That is, even though we know that the acceptance rates at NSF, NIH, the other major funding agencies across the United States and elsewhere, they're relatively hard to crack into. You got to make an effort to try. So make sure you then work carefully and effectively with the research office of your university, if you've got one. If not, work with your peers and colleagues to try to identify the kinds of places that you can successfully apply to, make an effort to do so, keep that going as best you can. Obviously, if you do seminars and symposia, great. When I say be careful, I'll talk about that in a moment. Rewards, participation in other symposia, keynotes, all of these things are positives. You just have to think about balancing out that time, though, because ultimately what really counts is the material that is either published or in press by the time you become moving into a tenure position, moving toward the tenure decision. B-list, edited volume. Now, if you go to the professor is in, she is absolutely, positively, completely against the idea of you spending your time doing an edited volume. Okay, and you can read her reasons, and they make some sense. I'm a little more generous about this, and I've seen edited volumes as in my deanship here. It depends a lot on your role in it and the degree to which you've shaped that symposium or session. If that's yours and that it is your clear intellectual creativity that's created the basis for that session, then I think putting together one of these volumes is not a terrible idea. You don't want to get bogged down though in these things. As you know, people can be slow. They often say, yeah, I'll get that to you next week, and it's 6 months later. So there is a time issue that's involved here. So you need to weigh this very carefully. There's no categorical no from my side, but I think there's a note of caution to be aware of. The one that you do not want to get involved in is that you're sort of the, second line organizer of the session, and the senior person says, why don't we do this? What why don't we do this tends to mean is, why don't you do this? And we'll slap my name on it at the end and we'll move it forward. Be really careful with that. Book chapters and volumes with light or minimal peer review. Don't waste your time on those. It's always great to get invited to do something, but unless you can guarantee that there's some level of peer review, just don't do it. Contributed papers, good, you need to do these, but again, don't spend a lot of time on these unless you're really going to get them into some kind of publishable form. Book reviews, again, the invitation's great, do some, but, I remember a colleague back in one of my previous jobs, I asked him very clearly about book reviews, and he said, I'm not going to try to imitate his accent, it was wonderful. He simply said, and this is his phrasing, his English, he said, book reviews, difficult, very easy to make enemy, better not to do book review if possible. So balance those out. They don't count very much is the point I'm trying to make here. They count some as recognition, but not as much as you might think. Don't do these things now. Textbooks, more writing about things, ephemera, columns in, anthropology news and things like that, great. They don't count. It's one thing, if you're getting your ideas out, maybe it helps, but don't spend a lot of quality time on these things. And if you're a blogger, cut back, kind of do a intervention on yourself and don't do as much of it as you think you need to do, because ultimately that, unless you've got tremendous amounts of energy, blogging really takes away a lot of your quality time in writing the things that really make a difference here. Here's some things to think about, and we can talk about these if there's some questions and answers that come up, questions that might come up. Do I need to be worried about citation counts or metrics? Well, that depends. Citation counts are simply someone going into one of the indices that are relatively easy to get these days. They go through and try to find the number of times in which your article has been cited by somebody. Well, clearly, if your article is in press, it's not going to have much of a citation count. If it's been out and it gets cited by mostly people in books, that's going to be tough. Some sorts of indices do better than others, but anything that is not comprehensive, you won't necessarily look good. So you'll need to find out from your program whether or not they really value and emphasize citation counting. There's other metrics, though, that are out there. Page hits if you have articles online that are out there. There's something called the H index that we could talk about. These tend to be ways that are supposed to directly measure your impact on the field by simply looking at the number of citations in a somewhat more quantitative way. All of these things just depend. So, for instance, in my school here, it's social sciences, humanities, and arts. The people that are in what I would call the harder social sciences, they get really hung up on telling me what the H index of a particular candidate is. And from my perspective, I really don't care. I'm looking primarily at the venue of the publications and the way in which the external case writers describe these things, rather than the H index, which to me, for many of the things that we do in anthropology, We just don't get measured in this way. So, but be aware of these things. Obviously, having the material out and being published by the time you come up with tenure is important, but in press counts. But again, the downside of in press, of course, is that nobody's seen it, and therefore, or at least few people have seen it, and therefore, it's often difficult to get external writers to write about it unless that material is directly sent to them by your university, which is often the case. The third bullet point is one of these things that I was a little surprised about when I was doing research for this webinar, and it's the difference between what's called a career review or a, as I put it, since you've been here review. At the University of California, it's a career review. Your tenure review is what have you done over the course of your career since, since you started. So material that you published as an undergraduate counts. Obviously you need to be showing, independence of research, you need to be showing a clear research trajectory, but the fact that you're publishing and have a long trajectory of so doing over the course of your career makes a difference. But some departments, as I ran into, said, no, the only things that we're really going to count are the things you produce while you're here. So that puts a different cast on the way in which you want to think then about your career trajectory and how you're going to then publish. Find that out early and start moving directly to take care of that issue. Open access or digital products, I'll kind of mold these together. Some open access publishing venues are now being very fully vetted by deans like me. I have no problem with open access publishing ventures as long as I can guarantee to myself that there is a significant level of true peer review. But again, there are lots of predatory publishers out there that say they peer review when they don't, and you need to be very careful about where these venues are and who's actually editing. So be super cautious about open access publishing venues if they're from these kind of, I wouldn't call them fly-by-night, but shadier ones where there's no strong academic reputation that lies behind them. Digital products, well, that could be a database. That could be, a number of other sorts of digital humanities type things. That depends a lot on your program. And there's differences of opinion on whether or not databases, for instance, should count. Should you publish your, aspects of your field research in a format that looks more like a database, if you have a visual format or, a lot of field notes or things like that? Those are probably places you don't want to get involved in at this stage of your career. But again, you don't want to spend a lot of time on this at the moment. This is not going to provide you with the most bang for your time in this instance. Quality teaching, it's pretty straightforward. You can see there, everybody worries about student evaluations. Well, just do your best. If you have innovations in the classroom, do your best. Other metrics of assessment, the assessment world is becoming more and more, onerous for universities. Depending on where you sit and what they demand, these things that are called program earning outcomes can be very tedious to create. They spend a great deal of your time and others' time developing them and assessing them. You may be in a position where you have to work on these extensively. They can help you, but they can also take a great deal of time if you're in a position that requires them. So be aware that that's becoming an increasingly significant part of teaching at the university level, especially at master's universities and baccalaureate institutions, but also at research-intensive ones like mine. Quality service, okay, do as little as you can, but be a good departmental citizen. My point being is that you need to be sheltered as much as you can. Don't volunteer unless it's absolutely critical. Don't fall into the service trap. Don't think that if you do a lot of service, people are going to love you at the end of the tenure process just because you've done service. They will not. They'll go, wow, they really did a lot of service, but, and you can feel the ... coming, but they haven't really done the kind of research that they need to do. So there's a balance here of things you're going to have to worry about. Service to your program in school, service to the discipline. It always looks great to review papers and grant proposals, but be judicious with your time. And then if you do applied work and there's community engagement, there may well be a place for you to demonstrate that by getting letters from their organization that you've worked with, testimonials about the nature of your activities with them. All of those become important, but again, keep in mind that those are things that are not as dramatically important as the publication process down the road. So where are we now? We are in the process. These are things now that you can that you need to be doing to get moving this process forward. When I say learn how to tell time, understand what your tenure clock is. That is, depending on the kind of program you're in, you need to know how many years do you really have in order to get your tenure case moving forward. Have you been in a visiting professorship that's now transformed into a tenure line, an official tenure line? Does that visiting year count? It may or may not. You need to know these things as you begin to then calculate your clock. And then be clear on the dates. That is, when do I need to have certain kinds of documents ready to go? Your department should be able to tell you these things. If not, if you don't have a department that does this, then the university itself will be able to tell you these things in smaller places. Pre-tenure reviews, take those absolutely seriously. You know, in my university, we have a mid-career appraisal that rates people and we have 3 stages of it. We are 3 levels of it: good, fair, and poor. Good means, yeah, you're doing well, just keep it up. Fair means you're doing okay, but we see some caution, you know, and here's the things we want you to do to fix that. And then if you get a poor, that means you're in trouble, and you may be able to salvage the situation, but the point now is that you've got to do these steps right away. So when you get these pre-tenure reviews, you know, take them really seriously. Do not laugh them off. Do not think that just because you're good, that means it's all in the bag. It is not yet. When I say document everything, what I mean by that is clearly anything that's done for the course of your career that you do, from the smallest to the largest, at least have a record of it and do it relatively close to the time at which you did it so you remember it, because all of those things get folded into a tenure dossier of some kind, and therefore you need to be able to remember them. Okay, what happens next now that you've got a dossier? So here's the process. That is, you assemble this. You have a CV, you have a statement of research, you have a teaching philosophy, you see all the materials that you require there. You'll notice the external referees report, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So that's your job. Now, many departments like mine, our university has a very formal, very, very deliberate, very staged process that helps you create this. Other places are going to be more laissez-faire. You need to understand, though, if you're in one of those situations, just what it is you really need to do when. Here, we tell you exactly what those dates are. It's your job to catch up. So be aware of the local differences there. So if you've accumulated all this material, then it goes to somebody. It goes to a they. Who are the people now that are going to look at your tenure case? And here they are. Each one of these has a web link that goes along with it. And this is from the Chronicle of Higher Education. It's a guy who's been writing a number of these things for the last 5 or 6 years. I found these really useful and valuable in thinking about some of the details about how these different sorts of players in the tenure process evaluate things. And so I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but you really should go off and read each and every one of these as you're beginning to think about your own case and take the lessons to heart. You know, the department head or chair, obviously a key player, but depending on the nature of your program, it might actually be the head of or chair of the promotion and tenure committee, or it might actually be the person who writes the case itself. That is, when you're going up for tenure, you submit all your documents, and usually what happens, depending on the university you're at, one individual or committee of individuals is charged with writing the tenure case. That is, they will write this and they will present that then to the other people that you see on this list. So understanding what their expectations are, understanding something about those individuals, understanding where they sit in the cultural framework of your program really becomes important. So it's not as if you need to cultivate their friendship. Don't make an enemy of them, certainly. The point being is understand their expectations very clearly. External reviewers, boy, these are absolutely critical. Here at the University of California, what happens is that the school gets to select people out of a list that we generate on our own, and you, the candidate, are often allowed to do that as well. That is, you're asked to come up with names. People that you can't come up with are people like the dissertation advisor, bad idea. Other people as well, though, that can come up with, you have a list then. Some universities have a very small number. Some research universities, I saw Columbia requires 12 to 15 external reviewers. That's a lot. Clearly, you need to be paying great attention to that. That's where your network really kicks in this process. People who vote on your dossier, usually it's only the senior members of your faculty. And so again, understanding the factions, understanding the nature of the culture, understanding how well you tried to prepare yourself for and integrate yourself within that culture is extremely important. There's usually on most campuses some kind of campus-wide promotion and tenure committee. That is, they take the dean's recommendation, which we'll talk about in a moment. They take the case writer, they take the department's recommendation, they make their own assessment of it, and then they pass that up to the next level. These can often be opaque. I wouldn't call it a star chamber, but I would simply say that it's often very difficult to get a sense of how those groups make decisions about the tenure process. So it behooves you then to start talking to some of your senior colleagues at this point about, well, what has it been like working with these people over the years? What do they tend to focus on? What don't they like? So understanding the nature and composition of that committee becomes extremely important. And then finally, what will happen is that all of these recommendations from below get passed up the chain of command then. So I'll get that as dean, I write my own recommendation. That recommendation goes then to this tenure and promotion committee and simultaneously goes to my provost. Ultimately, the provost makes the call on a particular tenure case. Usually they go along with the decision, but there are times when they disagree. And in cases where there's even disagreement at the provost level, the president of the university can be brought in as well. So understand what your hierarchy is in this particular case. That is, you need to know what the local circumstances are, but this gives you a flavor then of the sorts of people that you'll be involved with during this process. Finally, the last image is that, okay, now that you've seen what the general steps are, how are you going to make it easier for yourself to get tenure? You get a mentor, and better than more than one. Get one that knows your departmental politics. Don't get one that's political, I mean necessarily highly political, because that can be dangerous. Get somebody who can give you clear feedback, a senior scholar who can help you do this work through your program. Get external mentors as well. The more people you can bounce your ideas off of and the work that you have, the better it is for kind of creating a more robust dossier for your tenure. That's obviously the second one then. Get the feedback as best you can. Feed your network as best you can. Keep them in the loop about what you're doing. Don't let your network slide. Make sure that they understand where you are, what you're doing, what meetings you're going to. Will you see them? Keep up with folks. Make sure that they are aware of the quality of your work and the kinds of things you're up to. We said this earlier, but do it. Make sure you do it. Document everything, and I mean everything. And that's one of the things that often is easy to let slide. But if you forget things that are important, like service and outreach, that your program might in fact covet or cherish as a way in which you get tenure, if you've forgotten those things, that counts against you in some sense because it looks like a relatively thin record. Play nice. Well, that's hard. Don't sell your soul. That's even harder sometimes. The link is a great link. It basically says, don't be arrogant. Don't be a jerk. Don't be difficult. Don't think you walk on water. You might be great, you might be wonderful, but you need to understand how you fit into that culture. It's just not worth your trouble to make enemies when you don't have to. Learn how to say no. Wow. I mean, I've never learned how to say no during the course of my career, and sometimes it really comes back to bite you. It's hard for a junior person to say no to a senior colleague, to say no to some request to do something that might be slightly tangential to the way in which you see your research developing. It's a judgment call. Learn how to say no, but learn how to say it nicely. Learn how to create boundaries for yourself, but be clear and compassionate and eloquent about the reasons why you're setting the boundaries as best you can. And finally, the last and obvious point is, work hard, but work wisely. Do the things that are really going to matter within the local culture to promote yourself as best you can, to the discipline as well, so that the tenure case then should be a slam dunk rather than kind of a nervous and very, very painful process to go through. You're going to regret it, and you're going to be nervous and anxious and upset and stressed out over it. But if you can demonstrate to yourself you've worked hard and worked wisely, it will help you feel better about the way in which this develops over time. So that's the end of my comments. I see we have some time left for comments and questions if there are some. So I'll turn this back to you, Dion, and see if there's anything we can talk about further.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And just to reiterate my earlier points, questions can be submitted using the Q&A tab or the comments chat box as well. You can send your questions there. The first question that we have is, Mark, can you provide more detail on how to organize statements of research and teaching for the tenure review process?
You know, these are parts of the dossier that it sounds like they're easy to develop, my statement of research, but it really isn't that easy. And, you know, most people just don't get it. I mean, we try to coach people as best we can on what this is supposed to look like, but sometimes it just takes 2 or 3 iterations. Essentially, what you're trying to do when you write this document is, okay, you say, look, these are the major themes of my research. These are the things that have driven me to do the thing. These are the things I want to do with my career. And although you might change your mind about some things down the road, it's what you see your career developing over the last 5 years or so and where you would like to take it. So you want to emphasize the things you think are important about how you've structured your research to address those themes. So it really then becomes more of a thematic statement. So you address the themes and then you show how Grant A worked to address theme A, or publications 1, 2, 3, 4 address theme B. So in other words, you're trying to create this larger intellectual infrastructure that then the things that you actually do inform that intellectual infrastructure as best you can. So the worst thing you can do is say, well, I published this, and then I published this, and then I published this. Yeah, okay, you did that, but that's not the same thing as a research statement. I think the other thing you need to think about when you put that research statement together is that what kind of impact do I want this to have on the field? Why is this an important question? Why does anybody care in one sense other than me and maybe my mom? You need to be clear on why someone would actually care about something like this. I don't mean in the detail, obviously, but what difference does it make that we're studying in this way? So the statement of research really should be a creative document that you mold these things together. Statements of teaching, the same kind of thing holds. You'll spend less time on that, but again, if you're at a teaching intensive university, you better be really clear on the kinds of things that you see as the appropriate approach to pedagogy, thinking about learning outcomes, thinking about assessment, thinking about innovations. Again, think about the themes and then the ways in which you've addressed those themes effectively. You put those 2 documents together, those become important to the case writers, and then they, of course, become important to the external reviewers and then the people who review the cases as well. So take them seriously. They're not just pro forma exercises.
Okay, next question is, can you talk a bit more about choosing external reviewers and some of the guidelines around that? And specifically, are co-authors off the table?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Co-authors are not, okay, let's start over again. Co-authors are not off the table, but they're probably not going to be very helpful to you. What you need to do is you need to find in your network senior scholars who have read your work, they think your work is good, and you need to have developed a relationship with them. Or you don't need to have a relationship per se, but you need to be able to say that your work somehow relates to the body of work that they've been doing. So I think you have to be careful about these external reviewers. You have to find the right ones. Your Ph.D. advisor or your committee members, they're off the table. You should not engage them because that's obviously a demonstration that you really haven't become independent in your work and therefore need to do that. Co-authors, different story. It depends a lot on the degree to which, what you've actually published with them, the kinds of things that have published. Keep in mind that these reviewers need to be senior scholars in the field. They need to be tenured and senior scholars, not simply folks that you've worked with in the field or maybe at the same level or in some sense below you at some stage as well in terms of their career progress. My university says that a certain number of these individuals that are external reviewers have to be from the University of California system because that's, the system that you've been raised to go through. So other universities that are independent obviously don't have that requirement. So they need to be senior. They need to be people that would have a chance to read your work and comment upon it, hopefully favorably. If you know, though, there are people that are political or you've had cross swords with them at some point, they may end up on somebody else's list, but they shouldn't be on your list at this point.
Okay, and our last question, In your presentation, you mentioned quantitative measures of scholarly impact, and I wonder if you could talk about how one might prepare if their department or program sees this as important.
Well, some places really believe in that stuff, and so my only comment on that would be simply that you need to spend a lot of time getting these precise information about what it is they think they want to measure. So you need to be able then to show your publications, insofar as you can, actually can be measured in that way. As I say, though, in our field, biological anthropology and archaeology, to some extent, that's relatively easy because we publish in index journals for the most part. And so when you're out there, you can actually get citation counts or page hits or Google Scholar links or research, academia hits or, ResearchGate hits and things like that. If you can accumulate that information, if they need it, then at least you have that information at hand. But for many people whose disciplines are book-based or, book chapter-based, those tend not to easily be integrated into an indexing system of any kind. So you're going to be kind of at the mercy. So if you're in a program like that, you need to be clear on what their expectations are, but you also need to be able to be clear back to them, saying that these expectations, well, I can't meet them. Here are ways, though, to take a look at the impact of my work in a somewhat different way. So you need to be flexible about those things. You need to try to help them be flexible as well in the way in which they judge the work. And again, maybe relying more on the external reviewers as a way to judge that quality becomes more important within that context.
Okay, and one additional question has come through, and it is, does writing proposal reviews for agencies and manuscript reviews for journals count as service?
Yes, it does. It counts as service to the discipline. So usually what you should do under that circumstance is simply, get you don't have to show that you did this unless somebody's really, making you go through the ringer on this. But you should just have a list of the journals or proposals that you reviewed over the years. Every time you've been asked, put it in your document list of the things you've done. Be able to show that then at the end of the, during the process. And yes, it does count as service, and you should do those things as long as it doesn't significantly detract from the work that you're doing.
Okay. And that was our actual last question. I want to give a big thank you to Mark Aldenderfer for a wonderful presentation today. And a thank you to everyone who participated and joined us today.
Thanks very much. If anybody has any questions they'd like to email me separately, I'd be happy to answer them.
And the PowerPoint presentation from today's webinar will be available on the AAA website. And with that, we'll go ahead and sign off.
Great. Okay, thanks everybody for coming today. Much appreciated. Thank you, Dion. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.